helping you.
Oh yeah. I mean, Jesus Christ, again, I've been sleeping without booze or NyQuil. I've been able to get stuff done without piling through caffeine off of like I was at a year ago during these readings. I would sit and I'd probably have a day 400 mils of caffeine, which is a lot, by the way. Now it's 2 cups of Earl Grey a day. Lovely. Very, very helpful.
Yeah, sounds soothing.
Give everyone a moment or two to join as we sort of prepare to move into the proletarian class and praxis, bourgeois, and state, and more critique. This is a long section. I remember it taking a great deal long. It's 255. We're in the middle. I'm also streaming it if anyone just wants to. Give a moment for everyone to. How is everyone doing, by the way? Any exciting news for anybody? Anything interesting? Any stuff going on?
You want to hear a funny story?
I've said yes to you twice, and it's just been depressing so far today. But
Oh, this one's actually funny.
this is not you being sarcastic and fucking with me.
No, this is funny.
Go for it.
All right, I was just look. This was like an hour ago. I was at the bookstore, the philosophy section. I was looking for some analytic philosophy. I was trying to get this Quine book in the used section, and then I see this dude walk by. He's with this girl, and then he's arguing with her. He's like, "Oh, I don't think they'll have it. I don't think they'll have it." And the girl's like, "Well, you should just ask somebody. You should ask somebody." He's like, "I don't know. I mean," and then she's like, "Well, what's the name of the book?" And he says, "I'm looking for capitalism and schizophrenia." So I'm standing behind. I was like, "Oh, you want Anti-Oedipus or A Thousand Plateaus?" He's like, "Oh, I want Anti-Oedipus." I was like, "Okay, so it seems to be sold out, but here's a copy of The Accursed Chair."
A good start. Look at us. Look at us being helpful in the world.
And then he's like, "No, wait, what is The Accursed Chair?" I was like, "Well, it's they have a critique of scarcity. They have a critique of they have a critique of scarcity. They approach debt from the point of excess. Basically, some of the central premises about lack being the side effect rather than the cause is it's all there in Bataille, and it's basically a premise for Anti-Oedipus. But he's like, "No, I want the schizophrenia." I was like, "Man, you can't have the schizophrenia."
Did you refer him to plastic pills just to sort of finish that off?
I should have, right? No.
Well, it looks like we might have a smaller group today. I think I'll go ahead and kick us into it, and we'll get moving. I'm not cutting that. That stays in. I don't really give a shit. We're not an influencer group who heavily relies on people giving us money. We don't make money doing this. Jesus Christ. But I will kick us off on that happy note on how little capital we make doing this. Thank you for joining the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus. We are continuing for, I think, our fifth or fourth reading of 3.10 is the capitalist representation. Oh my lord, there's so much that happens in this. A normal thing I always kick off with, as I always do. If you feel like supporting us, and we don't necessarily need it, we have a lovely group who are helping us break even right now. Every dollar helps. We're putting together a big site with an attempt to try to do some kind of conference on the subject of divagations or wandering. And it's a bit of an undertaking, it turns out, but for now, I think I'll go ahead and dive in. Does anyone have, since a week has passed since the previous reading, does anyone have questions or thoughts or anything that's followed them as we finish what we were talking about before we move on. I figured I'd just open it up for general commenting, discussion, anything on those. If you have anything from last week's or the weeks before, really anything up till this point. I'm going to take that as a huge no. All right.
Just
Well,
want to say it's a great day for the DGQC.
yeah, there we go. Jesus. We're a fun group. We're about to move on and have the discussion about praxis and potential revolutionary movements, the way the social field operates. Again, just to go back slightly and revisit, and then I'll have Varun give some thoughts on it because I know feel like he'll have some. The previous conversation that they were having, the class that decodes the discussion that they were having in the previous paragraph as they've been building up towards this understanding of class consciousness or class servants or the bourgeois versus the proletariat. The final little bit here, I want to reread. The opposition is between the class and those who are outside the class, between the servants of the machine and those who sabotage it or its cogs and wheels, between the social machine's regime and that of desiring machines, between the relative interior limits and the absolute exterior limit. If you will, between the capitalists and the schizos in their basic intimacy at the level of decoding, in their basic antagonism at the level of the axiomatic, whence the resemblance in the 19th century socialist portrait of the proletariat between the latter and the perfect schizo. Having revisiting what these lines may be from a more modern context, then work has been done since on sort of breaking down further, especially in our weirdly atomized hyperdigital world, what this means. But I figured, Varun, I'd love to get a thought or two you had on this.
Which page are we on? I just want to.
Jesus Christ.
Jesus Christ.
Sorry.
It's 255.
I mean, I think we should just go ahead.
Yeah, we'll just charge ahead.
I don't think I have anything to say right now, though.
That's fine. That is why the problem of a proletarian class belongs first of all to praxis. The task of the revolutionary socialist movement was to organize a bipolarity of the social field, a bipolarity of classes. Of course, it is possible to conceive a theoretical determination of the proletarian class at the level of production, those from whom surplus value is extorted, or at the level of money, income in wages. But not only are these determinations sometimes too narrow and sometimes too wide, but the objective being they define as class interest remains purely virtual so long as it is not embodied in a consciousness that, to be sure, does not create it, but actualizes it in an organized party suited to the task of conquering the state apparatus. If the movement of capitalism in the interplay of its differential relations is to dodge any assignable fixed limit, to exceed and displace its interior limits, and to always effect breaks of breaks, then the socialist movement seems necessarily led to fix or assign a limit that differentiates the proletariat from the bourgeoisie, a great cleavage that will animate a struggle not only economic and financial, but political as well. Now, the meaning of just such a conquest of the state apparatus has always been and remains problematical. A supposedly socialist state implies a transformation of production, of the units of production and the economic rationale. But this transformation can only take place starting from an already conquered state that finds itself confronted by the same axiomatic problems of extraction of a surplus or surplus value, of accumulation and absorption, of the market and monetary reckoning. Consequently, either the proletariat prevails and transforms the apparatus in conformity with its objective interest. These operations are carried out under the domination of its consciousness or party vanguard, that is, for the benefit of a bureaucracy or technocracy that stands in for the bourgeoisie as the great absent class, or the bourgeoisie keeps its control of the state and is free to secrete its own techno-bureaucracy, above all to add a few more axioms for the recognition of the proletariat as a second class. It is correct to say that the alternative is not between the market and economic planning, since planning is necessarily introduced in the capitalist state, and the market subsists in the socialist state, if only as a monopolistic market of the state itself. In effect, how does one define the true alternative without assuming all these problems resolved beforehand? All right. And apologies if the channel was not unlocked. That's on me. Bumping up the ability of the channel to actually record higher quality as well. That should be a slightly higher quality. Hopefully can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. A lot is said in this paragraph. It's the reason I wanted to lead off with the previous, because the conversation of where class interests lie, or why someone becomes a revolutionary, or what even one does, starts to become the focus here as we start having the discussion about what we do with capitalism, what comes next. Very often the conversations you hear, and I think their critique here, is that we will simply have a more central planning of the economy, as a Chinese communism or whatever it's called, state planned. You might have a socialism with market tendencies, which I think is my favorite, a socialist state that does a lot more central planning. But the issue at this point that they want to talk about is that ultimately we're still talking about ultimately leaving the Urstaat in place, the market in place, the way that the capitalist socius operates still has its power within all of this that we're talking about. And as such, we tend to end in a place where maybe, as they say, they give the sort of possibilities. You have, on the one side, you have the proletariat. Maybe they actually make their way out. And they transform the apparatus in conformity with its objective interest. But ultimately, these are carried out under the domination of its consciousness or party vanguard, the people in charge, that for the benefit of the bureaucracy or technocracy, not for, they may say, the desiring machines. We're still playing in that space of this larger, ultimate, great absent class. Or perhaps the bourgeoisie goes, oh my God, how awful, proletariat, terrible life. Allow us to change it to a 40-hour work week, and maybe we'll allow you to have unions for a while, and we'll change a few of the axioms so that way you can subsist without being too awful. It brings to mind one of my favorite, and I favorite sarcastically, as I usually do, Kellogg's, Oreos, Nabisco had a big strike and went for a week or two. It was actually kind of a big deal. We don't hear about these things. Out the other side, though, these working class heroes who stepped aside, they got what they wanted. They wanted the ability to have only 6 days working in a row. Ooh, how exciting. And then they went back. The strike was over. The shift in what we have to fight for or how we fight still gets subsumed under this. It's still there in the capitalist state because planning is actually still there in any capitalist state. The market is always there in socialist states. So if this is the case, how do we find an actual alternative? Question proposed here as I read it. I leave it open. Please, anyone.
So first, let me say I apologize. I'm a bit under the weather, so if my voice is a little cracky or I'm taking more pauses than usual, I apologize. But yeah, I think you're pretty spot on, Brooks, that this is really about the question of praxis, right? And how it's going to be constituted. So if you go into the previous paragraph, this is just before the passage you read. In short, the theoretical opposition is not between two classes, for it is the very notion of class, insofar as it designates the so-called negative of codes, that implies there is only one class. The theoretical opposition lies elsewhere. It is between, on one hand, the decoded flows that enter into a class axiomatic on the full body of capital, And on the other hand, the decoded flows that free themselves from this axiomatic, just as they free themselves from the spot signifier that break throughout the wall, and this wall of a wall, and begin flowing on the full body without organs. Right? So there's this point leading into this paragraph about how to understand class, and this point that class itself is subject to codification, and that might not be the correct opposition, right? That might not really be where we need to look. If it's a question of codification, especially in capital, it's going to be a question of what's going on with the socius and decoding, and what's going on with the full body without organs here, right? Moving that into this paragraph, like you were saying, so if that's the thing, then if we're dealing with class interest, not only are we, at least in the Marxian literature I'm familiar with, dealing with class at a conscious level, right? False consciousness being the one of the hallmarks of Marxian critique. This idea that one is working with ideology even if one has this kind of conscience pushing them away from an ideology, just to kind of nutshell it. So if you're working at that level, right, and you're doing your critique through class consciousness and you're working at a conscious level, well, that's not going to help you with the unconscious production, and therefore you're going to miss the entire way in which anything that would be subject to class struggle is actually produced prior to that designation, right? Insofar as it would be a conscious thing, a conscious thing.
It's setting apart the things that we start to run into if we start splitting these things along the lines of the working class versus the bourgeoisie, because to be frank, Deleuze and Guattari both were absolutely bougie as fuck, but it doesn't mean that they weren't working towards it. Conversely, the Trump supporters, who are absolutely part of the machine, and proletariats by any meaningful definition of what that might be, support the system. So how do we demand that they have class consciousness? How do we force such a thing? Not do it alongside some lines that we'll just say don't really have much to do with the actual limits that people have to live by, or the actual effect that they have within people. And it reminds me of I was talking with friends about a film I love, Sorry to Bother You by Boots Riley. If you've seen it, go see it. When you talked about false consciousness, because the film is fully about that, the entire idea of that ultimately. And the characters throughout it go through those sort of moments. There's the main CEO of the woke company, Army, is played by Armie Hammer. It's a wonderful film. But specifically, he was cast that way because it was intended that the character is a lovable dude. And the line that's amazing that he says is, "I'm not your boss, I'm your friend." Speaking of false consciousness, the way people treat themselves and others.
Mm-hmm. And that's kind of my point. I read this paragraph as that Deleuze and Guattari, especially with that last passage I read, they seem to be kind of criticizing the idea of false consciousness, insofar as it might not actually be dealing with, more particularly, the second synthesis, right? But even insofar as the axiomatic is concerned, this almost reads to me like there's a way in which the socialist movements that they're talking about, because they're not dealing with this at an unconscious level, they don't realize that in a sense they're reproducing a lot of the things that they're supposedly trying to negate, right? Which is, I think, part of the reason in that passage they have negation in quotation marks. What if it actually affirms all of those things? So that seems to be the move here, is to say it's not about a bipolarity of classes, right? It's about this question of the schizophrenic limit and the capitalist limit of the capital is socius and the BWO, and what lines of flight can be created there, what breakthroughs are possible.
Well, and to go back to the previous paragraph, there's a translator's note that's worth having. They have the line, as they define it, the opposition is between the class and those who are outside the class. Now, the phrase that's actually used there is the hors classe, which is sharing an affinity, as the translator notes, footnote, with outcast or outlaw. This isn't someone who's outside of any specific class. No, there's a little bit more. There's a thrust out, a pushed out, sort of momentum of it. It's not, oh, I'm standing on the outside because I'm special. There's some force that's been done. The internals push towards the outside. They push outcast people. They outlaw people. They outclass people. Put people outside of the class. The phrasing's really important there, because again, we're talking about the place of a subject within the social milieu. Inclusive exclusion from Gambit. I do think when we're talking about homo sacer, for sure here, that type of sort of feeling, I would say, or emotion that goes. Leaving open comments for a moment before I move to the next paragraph. All right. As we move on, the question placed at the very end of this. How does one define a true alternative without assuming all these problems resolved beforehand? Phenomenal question. It's sort of similar to Zizek's, oh, you've had your revolution, now what? Another great line on to say, now what? The immense accomplishment of Lenin and the Russian Revolution was to have forged a class consciousness consonant with the objective being or interest of the class, and as a consequence, to have imposed on the capitalist countries a recognition of class bipolarity. But this great Leninist break did not prevent the resurrection of a state capitalism inside socialism itself any more than it prevented classical capitalism from getting round the break by continuing its veritable mole work, always affecting breaks that allowed it to integrate into its axiomatic sections of the newly recognized class, growing the uncontrolled revolutionary elements, no more controlled by official socialism than by capitalism itself, further into the distance, to the periphery, or into enclaves. Thus, the only choice left between the new terroristic and rigid axiomatic, quickly saturated, of the socialist state, and the old cynical axiomatic, all the more dangerous for being flexible and never saturated, the capitalist state. But, in reality, the most direct question is not that of knowing whether an industrial society can do without a surplus, without the absorption of a surplus, without a commodity exchanging and planner state, and even without an equivalent of the bourgeoisie. It is evident both that the answer is no, and that in these terms the question is poorly put. Nor is it a question of knowing whether or not class consciousness, embodied in a party or a state, betrays the objective class interest, to which a kind of potential spontaneity would be ascribed, suffocated by the agents claiming to represent that interest. Sartre's analysis in A Critique of the Dialectical Reason appears to us profoundly correct, where he concludes that there does not exist any class spontaneity, but only a group spontaneity, whence the necessity for distinguishing groups in fusion, the class, which remains serial, represented by the party or the state. And the two do not exist on the same scale. This is because class interest remains a function of the large molar aggregates. It merely defines a collective pre-conscious that is necessarily represented in a distinct consciousness that, at this level, does not even present any grounds for asking whether it betrays or not, alienates or not, deforms or not. The problem is situated there, between unconscious group desires and pre-conscious class interests. It is only starting from this point, as we shall see, that one is able to pose the questions issuing indirectly therefrom, concerning the class pre-conscious and the representative forms of class consciousness, and the nature of the interests and the process of their realization. Reich always comes back to us with his innocent standards, claiming the rights of a prior distinction between desire and interest. Quote, the leadership task has no task more urgent besides that of acquiring a precise understanding of the objective historical process than to understand a. What are the progressive desires, ideas, and thoughts which are latent in people of different social strata, occupations, age groups, and sexes? B. What are the desires, fears, thoughts, and ideas, the traditional bonds, which prevent the progressive desires, ideas, etc., from developing? Quote, the leadership has a tendency rather to reply, when I hear the word desire, I pull out my gun. What said this fucking paragraph?
Just to kick it off, one of the things that sticks out to me here is that basically, right, so if you're going to criticize capitalism and that, you have to deal with Marxism and what's happened with socialism and that. And there's often a question of how can you differentiate the two, especially insofar as does socialism, are you going to argue that it's made the break with capitalism, or are you going to argue that it hasn't come about yet? There are difficult questions that socialist thinkers have to deal with in that regard. And the thing I see Deleuze and Guattari doing here is they're saying that we're not really going to deal with those questions. What we're going to say instead is that with capitalism and with socialism, capitalism remains the socius in both cases, right? Insofar as we're talking about economic systems. So if that's the case, if capital remains the socius for the socialists and that for the Marxian Leninists and whoever, what they're doing then, kind of like I was saying before, is they're bringing codes into the pre-conscious, particularly class codes, and they're trying to move it into the consciousness, right, of people and so on. So by doing that, right, they are making something conscious that was unconscious, but they're kind of trying to project that onto people to deal with them in a form of subjectivity and a form of distribution that may not actually be quite the case, right? Instead, they're deducing from an axiomatic, right? And at the preconscious level, that's not going to give you the process of production. Instead, that's going to simply kind of affirm those very axiomatics in that, right? So what you end up getting is socialism still under I shouldn't even say under, socialism still as taking place on the socius of capital, right? It's kind of lackluster in that regard, actually.
I mean, there's also an element of modulation that occurs in subjection. I mean, these people are. I just think of like those really detached Marxist writers who are gonna place are gonna like just go and code people with certain desires, right? They're just gonna write, oh well, like this is what they actually want, blah blah blah. In that process, there's also a modulation that occurs for Deleuze and Guattari.
I would also say that part of this is a critique of the idea of class, as Marx talks about it. It's one of those things, despite some deep materialism and some lens there, classes are, transcendental. That they're the history of everything is the class struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and it's in itself that's fairly transcendental as a subject and as a thinking through process. So it's I found that that's one of the things I think they're hitting on here as well, that we need to actually take a step back and we need to have a conversation about what is the thing that's pushing this motor of history, these classes, and what are the elements that are doing this? Because by dividing people up sort of, again, determinate and transcendentally, we're also kind of committing some of the same paralogisms that we had.
Right, because it's something you, especially in those veins of thought, you almost take for granted, right? Who are the proletariats? Well, they're the people getting stuffed, right? and that's sort of helpful. But I think this is where this point about Sartre is coming in too, though. If it's not about kind of deducing from those codes, right? If it's not about the pre-conscious of people being screwed, it's more directly about the way in which uh, groups are formed and created, right? The production of those groups without necessarily the requirement of that codification, but instead the way in which an axiomatic will contribute to the formation of that group, as well as provide the potential for um, what they'll later call a revolutionary investment, right? But what they're now calling a breakthrough.
How do you separate the breakdown from the breakthrough?
Well, I mean, here the sentence that would stick out to me is the problem is situated there between unconscious group desires and preconscious class interests. So, I mean, to me, it would seem the breakdown would be the focus on class interest, right?
You could also argue that you're constructing a subject group. I mean, you're creating a subjugated group there, and that's another whole element of breakdown occurring. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with your point. I'm just saying that there's that other element to it as well.
Yeah, with you. It's your point about modulation, right? You're actually constructing the group in
Yeah,
these
I mean,
theorizations.
in the process of it's kind of like what they say about Freud, right? In the process of conceptualizing subjectivity from this point of view, you actually produce it in this way.
And I think that's what the joke is. To your point about, and I like that's parenthetical. The leadership has a tendency rather to reply when I hear the word desired. I pull out my gun, right? Like this was a problem at one point, maybe still is. That class interest in that is basically it's almost diametrically opposed to desire in this formulation, right? That you're just going to deal with interest, not desire.
In this formulation, desire is also seen from a very aesthetic point of view, right? Desire is considered as something base or like, so desire is just like, I mean, there's definitely like, you can argue that these people definitely think that there's some sort of presupposition of psychological egoism or blah, blah, all that kind of, I don't know, pre-modern philosophy style thought, state of nature, etc., etc.
I guess we have to move to our conclusion. That's even why it's kind of interesting to see them evoking Sartre here, right? Because his early work, there was no unconscious in his philosophy. But to now be reading this and like this idea of group subjectivity and group formulation and that paired with Reich to give you the unconscious desires. Um, I mean, just at a theoretical level, to make that move is also kind of interesting because, um, right, for Sartre, at least in his early work, since there's no unconscious, it is just consciousness. And like you're saying, little egos making decisions. Well, all right, I'm kind of simplifying there, but consciousness is making decisions with egos as horizons. But now they seem to be saying that even Sartre can be read as saying something altogether different. And if you pair it with this point about Reich, there's a way in which you can expand the project that Sartre would be working on later in his life, but also the general project of creating a breakthrough that opens up, right?
I do think early Sartre still has a theory of the unconscious, though, in the transcendence of the ego. Sorry, that's tangential, but
Yeah,
I agree with what you're saying.
he says he rejects it,
I
which
know
is
he rejects.
awesome.
I know he rejects. He says that, but it's still like there, like it's still in the background, because the transcendence of the ego has a genetic account of what the ego is, And I don't, and even if you would reject it, I don't know what you would call that, but the unconscious, right? I don't know. It's just my personal problem with Soch.
Any questions on this paragraph? Anything going through people's heads? All right. A lot of interaction from all of you. I'm sure you have questions. There's a lot that's said here, and we can go through sort of point by point because the things that they're talking about and how they break stuff down here is important. Some higher concepts, I think, that are worthwhile really getting through because we've talked through the axiomatics and we've talked through the Erstat, and they're starting to bring a lot of these things together, and they're starting to have a discussion about how these things actually operate. Because again, there's a non-class version of all of this as we sort of move through things. It talks through Lenin and the Russian Revolution. Um, one of the more extraordinary stories of, this fairly clear proletariat revolution that slowly became corrupted, changed, and shifted until Yeltsin, I guess, and everything that came with that. And it's an amazing change over time of what happened. Awful shit happened in the name of it. But their point early on is this great Leninist break, as he says, did not prevent the resurrection of state capitalism inside socialism itself any more than it prevented classical capitalism from getting around the break by continuing its mole work, always affecting breaks of breaks, integrated into axiomatic sections of the newly recognized class, the Bolsheviks, these new people who are in charge of the proletariat. Oh my. And suddenly this axiomatic was created that allowed these things to be part of it and integrated it. And ultimately, they don't have capitalism in the laissez-faire, ridiculous neoliberal sense, but capitalism's still there. It's still the reason production got organized as it did, and still the reason that they had these incredibly brutal laws and rules around the entire thing as they grew. The line that they end it with, the leadership has a tendency rather to apply. When I hear the word desire, I pull out my gun. That's a lot of these places, a lot of these setups. And as they start going through this paragraph is very much about discussing with that, getting back to that, and then the simple standards, the rights of a prior distinction between desire and interest. This playing back to what desire actually wants instead of demanding a class interest be this. This is their class interest. That, oh, if you're a proletariat, your class interest is X. A bourgeoisie, your class interest is X. And that's determinate. Again, I go back, this idea of a transcendental subject is deeply anathema to everything we've discussed up to this point, and for sure for Deleuze and Guattari. And the idea of saying that a class interest is X and that you're part of that class, we're talking about something as insidious as Oedipus at that.
Wait, Brooks, I'm confused. When you mean transcendental, do you mean it in like the theological sense?
The teleological sense, maybe?
The theological sense, like transcendental. You don't mean it in the Kantian sense, right?
Please explain the difference to me.
So the Kantian sense of the word transcendental is that within experience there is something that conditions experience. That's pretty much what it means, right? So there are concepts that space and time constitute experience while being elements of experience as well. That's transcendental. Then there's the theological sense of the word transcendental, which means that outside experience there are things that determine experience, right? So like God.
I would say it's probably more the first, more the Kantian. This idea that there is a such thing as a class interest, that classes have a very particular interest, is itself a transcendental subjectivism itself. There's the class struggle model at that basic level is presuming that at the thing that conditions experience level.
Did we by chance wander back to the whole distinction between the transcendent and transcendental?
I mean, you mean like you think that there's a transcendental notion of class?
I think that's how people refer to it. When they say a thing
I mean,
like
yeah,
the entirety of history is a struggle between the bourgeoisie and the
yeah,
proletariat, yes, because
yeah,
that's
yeah,
what Marx said. I would say that's,
yeah. No, no.
and I'm not
I
saying
agree with.
that's what it is. I'm saying that Deleuze sees that and goes, "Hey, wait, let's take a second. That's stupid." And we instead need to take a step back. We have these pre-conscious class interests, uh, which we've ascribed to these classes, and we say this is what they want. That's not what they want. We've assigned that, and that is what I'm talking about. The transcendental subject of class
Okay.
is
Yeah,
the critique.
yeah, the presupposition that there's one class that is universal. There's like a class that is universal and necessary. Yeah, I would agree with
Right.
that point.
Yes. Perhaps I worded it wrong, but yes, that's more what I'm talking about, and that's
No,
I
no, I
think
get what you mean. No, you make sense. It makes sense. I get what you mean.
and I think that's their critique of, again, Deleuze likes to make the joke that he takes philosophers to like another extension. He takes them from behind, but he's kind of just pushing them in the direction they're already going. Marx's entire like thing is this hyper materialist analysis. That's like Marxism sort of 101 is like a materialist analysis of the world. But he starts from this place of this Hegelian dialectic through history, that it's these factors, and it's this very interesting, I don't know, it's a very, the joke, what's the joke? Jordan Peterson says Marx is postmodern, and it's like, no, Marx has a very specific narrative of history that he really believes is real.
Yeah, I mean, like if you take, the Hegelian notion of dialectic, you're basically talking about two things that can't exist without the other, right? This is a sort of simplified way of talking about the Hegelian dialectic.
Mhm.
We talk about a relationship where determinacy is determined by relation, so one thing cannot exist independently of its relation with the other thing. And class will be thought of similarly in that manner.
Yeah, and it's the transcendental concept of class. I don't know. There's some wording around it I'm still trying to work through, but I think that's a big push for them here, is having that discussion, because again, all of it comes down to one thing: what the fuck are the actual desires? Like, what's actually powering this great engine? It's it's the desire underneath, and desires are thing to sort of reduce a lot of this to. It's not class. It's nature. It's not these sort of overarching narratives. It's getting back to the actual desire connections that are at play, that are powering all of this.
That is the kind of interesting thing about this right quote too, right? The leadership has no task more urgent, besides that of acquiring a precise understanding of the objective historical process, than to understand what are the progressive desires, ideas, and thoughts, which are latent in people of different social strata, occupation, age groups, and sexes. So right there, right, what is latent in the conjunct of people, right? In their subjectivity, what are the latent desires? And then B, what are desires, fears, and ideas, so-called traditional bonds, which prevent the progressive desires, ideas, etc. from developing. So to simplify that, what is constituting the wall for these desires?
I would even take it another step. It's not even the wall. It's things. If we just break everything down to like its core molecular, and it's these desiring machines, I, as a subject, am not a single desiring machine. I am a multiplicity. So are all of you. So within Brooks, what is the desires on the one side that are latent within me, and that you do this for everyone, that are out there, desires, ideas, and thoughts, which are latent, And what are the desires working against this? Because that's like, I am myself working against myself. The desiring machines within me are, conflict. We're not one. There's a bunch of movement happening. And that's the case you need to do across the board. This is, to me, the Reich's point here, and it's, I think, the point of the text that this comes from, that they've been kind of borrowing from throughout the book. Ultimately, it's, why do people want X? Well, it's not that people want a thing. It's that they're complex and you need to find all of their desires, ideas, and how they're thinking, how they're working against each other. And ultimately, that's what produces the refined element, the clash of things, the way that they're viewing it. And the push here, as they're saying, is to get back to what are the desires at the base level, because you'll find ones working for and against kind of a lot of these different things. And ultimately, no one wants desire. Leadership doesn't want to go, well, what do people really want? It's not a thing you hear in politics. It doesn't exist. They tell people what they want, but they don't want to have the discussion, because at that point, anytime, as they say, leadership hears the word desire, they know, they're terrified. They know exactly what desire is. And it's not a lot. It's mostly people just kind of want to be cool and happy and doing a bunch of shit. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it terrifies them because they need to keep that desire in check and codified and or axiomatized, I might say. That carries us into the next paragraph. Please, Jack, go ahead.
I was just saying, this is the big, to borrow a term from the logical sense, the image of thought kind of thing. But more simply, this is a big pathetic point that they keep making here, right? So in lieu of class struggle, what do you have? You have latent desires, or at least you have desires following the unconscious of self-production. And then you have ways in which those desires flow throughout society and can be blocked, right? Or that their flows are kind of being channeled in certain ways, which you get in the primitive section where they're going over that plus and minus system. But yeah, that's the image of thought, or rather, that's what you get in lieu of a class struggle. You get basically you get this point about desire and how it's flowing, and then right, instead of like a bourgeois like mastermind, right, this kind of anonymous overlord, even though they're still making this joke about leadership with the gun, since it is unconscious, you have a way in which at the level of the unconscious that it finds itself being blocked and channeled in different ways.
And I mean, that just leads in. The next paragraph is one of my favorites. So apologize if I get it a little bit too much. Desire can never be deceived. Interests can be deceived, unrecognized, or betrayed, but not desire. Whence Reich's cry, no, the masses were not deceived. They desired fascism, and that is what has to be explained. It happens that one desires against one's own interests. Capitalism profits from this, but so does socialism, the party leadership. How does one explain that desire devotes itself to operations that are not failures of recognition, but rather perfectly reactionary, unconscious investments? And what does Reich mean when he speaks of traditional bonds? The latter also belong to the historical process and bring us back to the modern functions of the state. Civilized modern societies are defined by processes of decoding and deterritorialization. But what they deterritorialize with one hand, they reterritorialize with the other. These neo-territorialities are often artificial, residual, archaic, but they are archaisms having a perfectly current function, our modern way of imbricating, of sectioning off, of reintroducing code fragments, resuscitating old codes, inventing pseudo-codes or jargons. Neo-archaisms, as Edgar Morin puts it. These modern archaisms are extremely complex and varied. Some are mainly folkloric, but they nonetheless represent social and potentially political forces, from domino players to home brewers via the veterans of foreign wars. Others are enclaves whose archaism is just as capable of nourishing a modern fascism as of freeing a revolutionary charge. Ethnic minorities, the Basque problem, the Irish Catholics, the Indian reservations. Some of these archaisms take form as if spontaneously, in the very current of the movement of deterritorialization. Neighborhood territorialities, territorialities of large aggregates, gangs. Others are organized or promoted by the state, even though they might turn against the state and cause it serious problems. Regionalism, nationalism. The fascistic state has been, without a doubt, capitalism's most fantastic attempt at economic and political reterritorialization. But the socialist state also has its own minorities, its own territorialities, which reform themselves against the state, or which the state instigates and organizes. Russian nationalism, the territoriality of the party. The proletariat was only able to constitute itself as a class on the basis of artificial neo-territorialities. In parallel fashion, the bourgeoisie reterritorializes itself in forms that are at times the most archaic. To continue the previous paragraph, essentially dive into what we were discussing with transcendental classes that we get put into, or the demand of it. Oh, these are the things that your class or your group enjoys, and now have been brought forward. The traditional bonds of society, from film to sport to books to anything, these are the elements, and they're ultimately played with inside of the market, whether capital or socialism, doesn't matter. Market likes this, capitalism loves this and plays with it and utilizes them to shape those desires. Good passage.
Should we go into the distinction between desire and interest?
Ooh. Yes. Please, jump in it. This is a good one.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the simple way to put it is that the distinction would be sexual.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it.
Simply put, I mean, I'm sure we've all experienced this if you're over a certain age, right? Everyone has sexual desires. So the way those sexual desires work is the way you desire something. So for Deleuze and Guattari, I mean, there is a certain universal element to sexual desire. By varying intensities, people have different sexual desires, and all desire is sexual. No desire is not sexual for them. So even, I don't know, like wanting a new item from the store or something, that's a sexualized desire as well.
Yeah,
so
there's an energy behind it. Not to speak in I tend to try to talk about this more in topological terms, because we're talking about like the pressure behind a desire. Desire has a push. It's connecting. It's disconnecting.
I think of it in terms of drives.
Yeah, it's very much about that. It's the pressure of it versus, oh, it's in your interest. It's in your interest to go to work tomorrow. Like that. I don't know anyone who gets super hard thinking about that. That's like, okay, cool. Yeah, no, I've got to go to work tomorrow. Or it's your desire. I mean, even some simple things. It can even be semi-representational. I'm going to be writing a book. I want to write a book. In my interest to write a book. The wording there is innate, I think, and hits us specifically.
So Deleuze and Guattari's point is that what's primary is desire. What's interest is the secondary after effect of the organization of desire. So desire first exists. So it's not like there's a distinction between the two, but it's rather than one is the second effect of the other. That's more the distinction we're talking about. Desire is converted to interest in the conscious in the world of conscious life, something like that. We go back to chapter 1, right? Why is desire not lack? Well, desire is not lack because desire does not exist independently of organization, right? You can't be hungry unless you have a digestive system. Desire always has to be organized for it to basically be desire. Desire doesn't exist outside of any form of organization.
Yeah, and it's great phrasing for it. I think Holland nails, which is coming out of a little bit later in the schizoanalysis chapter of this book, is ultimately desire first and foremost doesn't invest in anything; it invests force. Because when we talk about drive, there's like, again, that pressure, that drive, that push, the force is the first thing that really gets invested and pushed. Now, the degree, sorry, go ahead, Vern.
I mean, yeah, I mean, his point is basically because if soon as we give desire an object, you reinstitute lack. Because what is lack? Well, lack is the lack of something that you want. Lack. So logically, we deduce that lack is the result of failing to get a certain want. So if we had no wants, technically we wouldn't have any lack. So as soon as you place desire in a teleological realm, there's a difference. What's interesting about what Deleuze and Guattari are doing, they're taking the primary theory of drives in the early Freud, and they're detaching the drives from having any object. The object is rather the fact of organization that drives are organized around under, and in doing so, they're able to say that desire is productive just simply from that logical reorganization of what a drive is.
And interest is one of those things that I mean, this would be a thing actually we could discuss. To me, my understanding of interest is that it's effectively something that's rationalized post facto. Like,
yeah, it's conscious life basically.
Yeah, it's conscious life. It's I want X, Y, or Z because of thing X, Y, X or P or whatever. And again, as they've talked through the sort of emergent nature of subjectivity and how it comes when the subject looks back and goes, "Oh, that's what that was," and they're able to do that. The interest that they apparently have at that point, or they are told that they have, or whatever, they've learned. Oh, that's why I was aroused that time. It's because I want to fuck my mom and kill my dad because of Oedipus. And the interests that then get passed on through various paralogisms. Again, desire never lies. Interest can be fucked with in infinitely, forever.
Well, Brooks, how hot was your mom?
I mean, not as hot as yours.
Second.
It's a really good distinction, though. Again, desire is what we're getting to. So when someone says, and when they talk about what a class wants or what a person wants, this isn't that. Its analysis section is going to deeply get into what they mean, very particularly when it talks about getting to someone's desires. But it's important to understand the difference between the interests and the desires. That desire itself is an impulse that can't be deceived, and it may get fucked with. You have paralogisms, and they outline very early on in all of the second chapters how these things sort of get perverted and broken, and how desire as a force, surfaces in a lot of different ways. But you have to remember that we're breaking apart the surfaces, and we're actually talking about what makes them up and how these things get pushed and where the intensity of these things come from on the underlying.
One thing that I find really interesting about that is that no one in Deleuze and Guattari scholarship really talks about this, but for Deleuze and Guattari, desire is not one thing. Desire goes through transformation. So desire first, depending on the phase of the cycle, desire goes through many transformations before being this conscious thing. So desire is first libido, then numen, and then voluptuousness. So desire basically, there's basically actually, like, you could say there are like four concepts of desire for Deleuze and Guattari that all start at the level of unconscious and then go to the level of consciousness.
Yes. And interest comes at the very end of that shit. Very end of that shit.
Yeah, because interest is the consummating subject, basically. The subject that's constituted by its own desire. And then, mistakes. So basically what the subject does is that first the subject is constituted by its desire, and then mistakes that desire during the process of consummation as a form of construction of the subject, right? He needs to consummate to consume, and consume to basically create the subject. In that stage, there's a misrecognition whereby the desire he's constructed by, he assumes as his own desire. And that's what we mean by interest. The misrecognition, basically. And then again, like as soon as you institute that, of course, it's easy to see why desires lack for people like Freud, etc. Because whenever you make the misrecognition of the subject, of course, it makes sense to call desire lack. But when you think at the level of production, at the level of libido, before Newman and voluptuousness, you think about the contingency of desire as a form of organization rather than anything else. When you ask the question, right? How is it possible for this thing to even be a thing in the first place? That sort of transcendental question. Then you can basically prove an argument saying that desire is productive. But it's only from this transcendental point of view that Deleuze and Guattari have. Or to use his preferred term, from this perspective, if you read his work on Nietzsche and Leibniz.
Well, and at this point, this is where we start getting into the term neo-archaisms, where, and I know Guattari did a lot of writing on this specifically, talking about, and Deleuze as well. I mean, this is a little bit more ATP, but the discussion of resuscitating old codes, inventing pseudo codes or jargons, this sort of play that Edward Morton put forward. Modern archaisms are fascinating in that if we push for the stuff that basically capitalism or production or other things, the social machine left behind on the cutting room floor, I think the example he gives is African music. That the shift over time has been that as African music has made its resurgence, it's begun picking up pieces in its way. Now, it was left by the wayside some time ago by capital and by the state, the Western states especially. But now it's being reformed with new instruments that sort of existed in its own bubble, and now they're utilizing that. And these neo-archaisms are sort of fascinating in themselves, how they kind of become a sort of folkloric reterritorialization itself. And
wait, did you say Guattari wrote on it?
Yeah.
Are you assuming Guattari can write?
What?
You're assuming that Guattari can write?
He did. He wrote a lot.
Yeah, but have you seen his writing?
I'm just saying, he talked about this. I've only ever read the typewritten. I don't read French. What the fuck?
Like, he doesn't know how to write. Like, each sentence doesn't flow with the next.
No. It is a lot clunkier than a lot of Deleuze's work, which tend to be a lot of very beautifully prosaic bits. But like again, it's the idea of diving back into this the way that African music did. He equates it too, and Deleuze does too. I want to say this is from Chaosmosis. I need to find the essay specifically, but it's doing so. We're able to then take older forms of production, perhaps, and subjectivity, and then bring those into these small minor. Because this is the development of the minor that he goes into. We can bring those into modern setups, and suddenly we are able to have sort of these weird neo-archaisms that can help do some sort of weird shit as we go.
That's page 98 on Chaosmosis, where he starts going new aesthetic paradigm.
Thank you. God, what a good book.
Actually, I like Chaosmosis. It's got some, like all Guattari books, it doesn't make much sense, but it's got its moments.
Oh no, there's phenomenal moments of brilliance throughout it. Fantastic. I'm sure a lot of it is too. I can't ever click with his writings. Let's see, anything else? The archaisms that are opted by the state. Yeah, we kind of nailed that paragraph. Any other questions? Tiernan linked literally what I was talking about. Madhu Mokhtar, holy shit. Yeah. The heron rock and roll is just a cool sentence to say. I mean, in and of itself. But a Mongolian death metal, if you're into it at all. That's a real genre with throat singing and everything, and there's a few bands that are. Pinger Cavalry, specifically, my favorite. But again, these neo-archaisms, this is bringing those older back and bringing them forward. War Horse, specifically, turn it and just enjoy it. It's workout music, if there ever was a such thing. All right. Then I think I'll move to the next paragraph. It's a little shorter. A lot is said. The famous personalization of power is like a territoriality that accompanies the deterritorialization of the machine as its other side. If it is true that the function of the modern state is the regulation of the decoded, deterritorialized flows, one of the principal aspects of this function consists in reterritorializing, so as to prevent the decoded flows from breaking loose at all the edges of the social axiomatic. One sometimes has the impression that the flows of capital would willingly dispatch themselves to the moon if the capitalist state were not there to bring them back to Earth. For example, deterritorialization of the flows of financing, but reterritorialization of purchasing power and the means of payment, the role of central banks, or the movement of deterritorialization that grows from the center to the periphery is accompanied by a peripheral reterritorialization, a kind of economic and political self-centering of the periphery, either in the modernistic forms of a state socialism or capitalism, or in the archaic form of local despots. It may be all but impossible to distinguish deterritorialization from reterritorialization, since they are mutually enmeshed, or like opposite faces of one and the same process. Short and crisp. The conversation here is talking through that capital itself, thanks to having the state and the power sort of within it, the way capital works, there's almost it goes on forever thing, as we discussed earlier with the dx over dy nature of it, this ridiculous, expansive, explosive growth. But we have to be constantly reining it in. There are examples of the central bank's great. There are ending examples of the vassal states that have slowly come to dominate many of the areas that were once completely colonized, but now have their own capitalist system in place. I think of a lot of Southeast Asia. I think fits with this very, very cleanly. The sovereign nations in the Middle East, I put up quotes. The nature of these things that were once at the periphery of capital have turned into their own little states and their own little fiefdoms or despotic spaces. And it's difficult, as they say, to distinguish deterritorialization from reterritorialization, since they are enmeshed. They're one and the same faces of the same process. Really just coming down hard on the conception of the power structure within capital and how it applies even to capital itself. How I read that. Anyone? Varun? Kiernan? Back.
So I've been trying to think of the axiomatics here because I still kind of struggle with them. And how they might be distinguished from reterritorialization, or if they would be necessarily introduced after reterritorialization, or
I have a wonderful piece. I'm going to see if I can find it. I want to say it's Holland wrote a fantastic short bit on capitalist axiomatics. I think it's only in.
I think I know what you're talking. No, I think I know what you're talking about. I'll try and load it.
I have it right here. But the concept of axiomatics is not easy to grasp. I'll just start there. I'm not sure I do. What I will say is that I love the concept of it from a intuitive stance, because we're talking about something that's a different shift. Whereas once desire was laid out in front of us, and we were told what to do by sort of the intersection of our affiliative or our alliant lines, what to continue surviving and keeping the family going, to have more kids and to survive with the alliances that we needed to form amongst other people and ourselves and other tribes. This push through time that they discuss, and the way desire is marked and the way desire is controlled by that and shifted And then suddenly we're in this place where now that's not really what matters. Now it's axiomatization, a completely different shift in terms of how we handle a great deal of our own understanding of why we're allowed to do certain things, what we're allowed to do, and how we set these things up in front of us. The piece there, I only have the doc. I don't actually even know where I got that. I didn't write it. I'm not going to even pretend I even come close to writing such a thing. But it's a fantastic breakdown of the term of the axiomatization that they take from mathematics to bring over here. We talk about how multiplicities operate, talk about comparability and homogeneity within the entire thing.
Yeah, thank you for sending it.
Yeah, it's I'm trying to find, there's a paragraph in here that kind of nails the setup. Now, one of the great strengths of Rolf's work is to propose treating the market as an intensive multiplicity, like temperature, depth, and distance. There's a difference between paying $5 and paying $10 for one pair of shoes, completely distinct from the difference between paying $295 and paying $300 for a different pair of shoes. $5 does not equal $5. In a similar vein, no one paying $300 for a pair of shoes would buy 20 pairs of shoes costing $15 each. $300 is not $300. And yet, on the recording surface of the market, one pair of $300 shoes is evidently the same as 20 pairs of $15 shoes. $300 is $300. So from the perspective of an investor, in sharp contrast with that of the consumer, $300 might well equal $300, whether in high-fashion stilettos or cheap sneakers. It begins to look as though the market surface under capitalism is asymmetric, has two sides, one that faces consumers, the other facing investors, one of which answers to the axiom of homogeneity, whereby a dollar, always and everywhere, equals precisely $1. Goes through from there, talking through, again, the difference between money and capital, which Varun literally brought up with Varun yesterday in a chat. The nature underneath all of this means that the rules of what makes a dollar worth what it's worth, or makes production do what it's due, isn't just any longer the direct, here is the market, it's mathematical and set up. There are rules. There are axiomatic rules that set up these things underneath all of it. This is what axiomatization is. The reason that we do things that is not connected to quantity. It's not connected to desire even. It's a completely different type of rulemaking. The conversation we have normally, the one I bring up, is that you work hard, you'll get ahead. That is an axiomatic that we experience within capital. It's absolutely not true. It's completely a load of bullshit. But everyone believes this, at least in some way, that it's, there we go. And I'm now working hard and I can get ahead. These are the rules that enable the system, because now it's not about my desires. It's not even about anyone's desires. It's about these agreed upon standards, these axiomatics that actually take place and start organizing. That's what capital does uniquely amongst all of them. Not simply that we have a market economy. That's a child's view of what capitalism is capable of. A real view is when we start talking about how it organizes production. How it organizes is through axiomatics, which is fucking weird. And it's a fairly accurate, as far as my personal experience and from what I've read, pretty fantastic setup when we start talking about it all. Is that a fair thing, Varun, as I rambled?
Yeah, I would say.
So to say from this deck, unlike pre-capitalist markets, the primary axiomatic function of the capitalist market is not the production, exchange, or consumption of goods, but the registration of obligations and the generation of means to repay an infinite debt.
Also, this essay mentions Jean Rolfe's abstract market theory, which is a book that's doing something else, but it's also a very good book on this topic. It's doing something else, though. It's looking at, Elia Ayache. It's a big guy. He was this big financial theorist guy, and he's looking at how can we understand derivatives through the perspective of Deleuze and Guattari. Specifically, I mean, his whole thing is on looking at financial capitalism, etc.
Great line
There's
from
another
this, just to continue and read another great line from it. Historically, one of the main reasons for adding axioms has been legal limitations placed on the length of the working day. To the extraction of absolute surplus value by forcing workers to work more hours than required to pay their wages is added the extraction of relative surplus value by making the hours they are permitted to work more productive. This entails the transformation of work through the introduction of scientific technology, although not expressed directly in terms of price. Scientific technology metricizes intensive flows of matter and energy in its own way, thereby making them susceptible to subsequent axiomatization as quantifiable factors of production on the market where their costs get priced. Even with pre-scientific craft production technologies, work has always involved attending to intensive properties of matter energy in order to counter-actualize one actual factor of production, say a piece of wood, by transforming it into a finished product, a salad bowl, a sculpture, a chair. But prior to the development of capitalist production, this attending to the intensive properties of factors of production meant mobilizing capacities, skills, know-how developed imminently in context over time and instilled in laborers through apprenticeships. With the advent of capitalism, two crucial changes occur. First of all, laborers are uprooted from their local context and obliged to work on means of production that are provided by capital from on high, for which they have to be trained anew. Their labor power is taken out of context, decoded, then recoded depending on the specifics of the means of production furnished by capital, specifics which themselves emerge only after the operative investment statements to invest liquid wealth in this or that productive enterprise have been made. Secondly, the know-how, once embodied in workers, is extracted from the workplace and developed in the laboratory into the abstract and supposedly context-free knowledge of science, ready to be reintroduced as technology into the production process as another factor of production. With conception increasingly segregated from and elevated above execution for these reasons, one result is that workers get deprived of agency at the workplace, which they will attempt vainly to reclaim as consumers. Another result is that the distribution of state-sanctioned knowledge segments among the population gets correlated with the distribution of wage segments, with higher rates of remuneration generally corresponding with access to greater amounts and/or more specialized segments of scientific knowledge. That's depressing. I hate reading this stuff sometimes. Did that help, Tiernan?
Yes, it did.
Good.
I'm also gonna try and load up and find that piece that I sent you above by Kerschlik on Suzanne Bronoff.
I have it right here. One moment.
All right, just put it in.
Take 2 seconds. We were having a discussion about the difference between money and capital, because this is where that kind of starts playing. Money is, in theory, quantifiable. It's worth $1 worth a dollar. But as I read, it's $300 is not always equivalent to $300, how it's paid for, what it's set up for. On top of it, money is static. Capital's not. Capital is exponentially growth within itself. It's a completely different way of thinking through it. Because of that sort of difference, there's a big change. Hirsch Lake, there it is. From Parrhesia, that one?
Yeah, Parrhesia, that's right.
There you go. All right. Continue to the next paragraph. We're not finishing this. The essential aspect of the regulation performed by the state is even more readily understood if one sees that it is directly based on the social and economic axiomatic of capitalism as such. It is the very conjunction of the deterritorialized flows that delineates archaic or artificial neo-territorialities. Marx has shown what was the foundation of political economy, properly speaking, the discovery of an abstract, subjective essence of wealth, in labor or production, and in desire as well, it would seem. It was an immense step forward for Adam Smith to throw out every limiting specification of wealth-creating activity, not only manufacturing or commercial or agricultural labor, but one as well as the others, labor in general, the abstract universality of wealth-creating activity. Quote. Here we have the great movement of decoding. The great movement of decoding or deterritorialization. The nature of wealth is no longer to be sought on the side of the object under exterior conditions, a territorial or despotic machine. But Marx is quick to add that this essentially cynical discovery finds itself rectified by a new territorialization in the form of a new fetishism or a new hypocrisy. Production as the abstract subjective essence is discovered only in the forms of property that objectifies it all over again, that alienates it by reterritorializing it. Although they had a presentiment of the subjective nature of wealth, the mercantilists had determined it as a special activity still tied to money-creating despotic machines. The physiocrats, pushing the presentiment still further, had tied subjective activity to a territorial or reterritorialized machine in the form of agriculture and landed property. And even Adam Smith discovers the great essence of wealth, abstract, subjective, industrial, and deterritorialized, only by immediately reterritorializing it in the private ownership of the means of production. Nor can one say in this regard that so-called common ownership changes the direction of this movement. Moreover, if it is not a question of writing the history of political economy, but the real history of the corresponding society, one is better able to understand why capitalism is continually reterritorializing with one hand what it was deterritorializing with the other.
I like this bit.
Yeah, wonderful.
It's wonderful.
I'll go into especially the line with the sorry, what's it? Oh shit! One of my classes just got canceled. Sucks. Sorry. Now, what I was gonna say was what they're saying with Marx and Adam Smith and Freud is that there's so basically that what Marx means by labor capacity, the fact that one of the things that Marx does is that he detaches labor from an object. He detaches labor from a teleological point. He thinks of labor as a capacity in and of itself, which is the same thing that Deleuze and Guattari are saying that desire is. And that, their reading of the early Freud allows them to do. They think of desire detached from any goal, desire without an object, that is, desire without a lack. The same thing that Marx has with labor without a lack, since it's detached from any particular purpose. The capacity of labor is wealth in itself for Adam Smith. Just the capacity, not the fact that you're doing something, but the capacity to do something. And that's the point that allows them to make this big shift of saying that desire and labor are the same thing. The fact that neither of them have any objects and they're just capacities. And Deleuze and Guattari actually feel that this shift isn't possible. It wasn't possible without someone like Adam Smith. So, there's some Adam Smith in Deleuze and Guattari, whether you like it or not.
It's a really crisp paragraph also, because one of the things we get asked a lot, and I get asked a lot, is how do we define out territorialization, deterritorialization, reterritorialization? How does it set up? And they give some very clean examples of how we do that, that as we start breaking down the concept or the flows of how these things operate, we're immediately able to pop in and we're able to start do this kind of on the fly as we break things down. It's a really fantastically interesting way they do it here, but it's just very crisp. If anyone has questions, please ask. I can't think of a way to describe this better than they do, and so I don't know where anyone may be having issues. Do not hesitate to ask, though, if you are. Otherwise, I'll move to the next paragraph. A little shorter, but also I think it's going to end up being one of a lot of discussion. In Capital, Marx analyzes the true reason for the double movement. On the one hand, capitalism can proceed only by continually developing the subjective essence of abstract wealth or production, sake of production, that is, production as an end in itself, the absolute development of the social productivity of labor. But, on the other hand, and at the same time, it can do so only in the framework of its own limited purpose, as a determinate mode, production of capital, the self-expansion of existing capital. Under the first aspect, capitalism is continually surpassing its own limits, always deterritorializing further, displaying a cosmopolitan universal energy which overthrows every restriction and bond. But under the second, strictly complementary aspect, capitalism is continually confronting limits and barriers that are interior and immanent to itself, and that precisely because they are immanent, let themselves be overcome only provided they are reproduced on a wider scale. Always more reterritorialization, local, worldwide, planetary. I have a feeling he'd add galactic here. That is why the law of the falling tendency, that is, limits never reached because they are always surpassed and always reproduced, has seemed to us to have as a corollary, and even as a direct manifestation, simultaneity of the two movements of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. Again, very crisp, cleanly explained. Some of this is great. Easy. Any questions, any comments? Because we're about to get back into axiomatics and move towards state again. All right.
I have a slight question there.
Please,
What
please.
does it mean by the subjective essence of abstract wealth or production for the sake of production? The subjective part is
That was the point I just made. So, for Marx, it's that wealth is so the subjective part about what Marx is saying is that basically labor that exists as a capacity in the subject is wealth in itself. So to understand, what wealth is for Adam Smith, you look at the subjective capacity, which is basically labor. Labor without what makes it subjective is the fact that it has no end goal. It's simply the capacity that subjects have.
all right. Thanks. Does it mean that the labor is treated as if each individual laborer is a subject? They have like some agency as consumers or something?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely do have agency, except that would be another point that I don't think it's the point that he's trying to make, that they're trying to make here. I mean, they definitely do have agency, and they definitely do. I mean, and you could talk about what would be interesting would be to ask the question about ownership with regards to labor capacity, right? Because as we go from the different historical periods that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about, you see that the way labor capacity is owned has been very different, right? We go back to the kinship relations that they were talking about, like I think couple hundred pages earlier. We'd be looking at the way labor capacity is tied together via kinship relations, and of course, today labor capacity is tied together via market relations. So, autonomy then has to be looked at through these different historical periods of the way the subjective capacity of labor's ownership has changed. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
All right. An important consequence emerges from the above considerations. The social axiomatic of modern societies is caught between two poles and is constantly oscillating from one pole to the other. Born of decoding and deterritorialization on the ruins of the despotic machine, these societies are caught between the Urstaat that they would like to resuscitate as an overcoding and reterritorializing unity, and the unfettered flows that carry them towards an absolute threshold. They recode with all their might the worldwide dictatorship, local dictators, and an all-powerful police, while decoding, or allowing the decoding of, the fluent quantities of their capital and their populations. They are torn in two directions, archaism and futurism, neo-archaism and ex-futurism, paranoia and schizophrenia. They vacillate between two poles. Paranoiac despotic sign, the sign signifier of the despot that they try to revive as a unit of code, and the sign figure of the schizo as a unit of decoded flux, schiz, a point sign or flow break. They try to hold on to the one, but they pour or flow out through the other. They are continually behind or ahead of themselves. Suzanne de Bruynhoff, who Varun mentioned a little bit earlier, I'm going to go ahead and just while I'm about to read her footnote, just copy over Marx on Money, so if he wants it, give it. Because that's the book that this is referencing, page 147. That is why in capitalism, even credit, formed into a system, brings together composite elements that are both anti-capitalist, money, commerce, and post-capitalist, not anti-capitalist, anti-capitalist, pre-capitalist, before. And post-capitalist, the credit circuit being a higher circulation. Adapted to the needs of capitalism, credit is never really contemporary with capital. The system of financing, born of the capitalist mode of production, remains a bastard. Great piece. Social elements of our societies. Let's talk about conservatives. I love listening to them. Ben Shapiro and the like. They're literally doing this when they talk about how they're pushing for a better future. They're heading towards it. They're wanting better things, and at the same time demanding we return. They're split between these elements and trying to find their place there. I would say the modern left is doing significantly much of the same thing. Modern left, in quotes. The
modern left. If I can send you some more Foucault and neoliberalism if you want. I love the modern left.
Goddamn Jacobin. The whole thing is right here. We're caught between things. The social axiomatic of these societies, modern societies, ours. Anyone who's in here is in one of these societies. Probably. Gonna assume. It's a safe bet. On the one side, our societies are born of decoding and deterritorialization, the ruins of this despotic machine. And we're caught between the Urstaat. We want to bring back as an overcoding and reterritorializing unity. We want everyone to tell us what all of these things are or will be. There's a comfort there in the fascism of the mind. At the same time, we're constantly on the other side decoding everything, capital, populations, extraordinary amount of all of it. It's the nature of modern societies to be doing these two things, to have these two poles that they're constantly moving between, with a oscillation in the megahertz, constant. Really amazingly well put bit here. Love it. Any comments, questions, thoughts, anything?
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment. Sorry, I think I'm starting to lose my voice a bit. So one of the things that sits out to me is they're going through the whole reterritorializing, deterritorializing process, right? One hand and the other hand, classic Deleuze and Guattari. One of the things I like about this paragraph is they're focusing again on the despotic signifier in that. So right there, and they open up this section with this point about McLuhan, and before they move into like what decoding and the axiomatic are going to do, they start out by talking about writing as despotic and capitalism as illiterate, although the news is slow to reach us, right? The point being that when with this process of writing, there's this concern for the despotic signifier, that signifier, which I think it's the despotic signified actually, that's signified, which seems to speak for the signifying chain, right? For desire, something that's detached and constituted as this kind of whole, which is where you start to get this point about lack, and just the first paralogism, let alone the second, moving into the law, law of the father, and that. The thing I like about this paragraph we just read is they're going back to that point about how a despotic signifier can be constantly erected through processes of reterritorialization, right? And yet at the same time, with the deterritorializing process, with the decodification process, that the axiomatic conditions, you have a way in which that very process I was just speaking about is not only undermined, but made possible all over again, right? Such that when the, for instance, when signification of that is going about with this process of something representing and appearing to speak for everything else, there's a way in which at the same time, and this gets into the problem of praxis, right? That problematic more so. At the same time, there's a way in which that very signifier will be torn down, right? Will be disseminated and destroyed through the decoding process. And yet at the same time, that in and of itself can lead to a reterritorialization or recoding where a new one is established. This means that the problem for any praxis is going to be not simply in tearing down a signifier and erecting a new one, right? This is something that capitalist socius already does. What Deleuze and Guattari are doing here, and this goes back to our point about why the proletariat is praxis, right? Why this has to be reconsidered altogether. Why you can't just take it for wholesale. Insofar as that you have these two processes in codependence, the problem for praxis is not going to be re-erecting a new signified or just tearing it down. Similarly, I think it's got to go beyond just reconfiguring that process altogether, which would just be a basic schizophrenic process, right? This is where the Deleuze and Guattari is trying to push us into trying to think about the revolutionary task in an altogether different way. One that's not simply about shifting things around any more than it is just in a pre-conscious way, kind of reproducing it all together.
All right. Thank you, Jack. Like that. Yeah, get yourself some water. I'm going to be going into the next paragraph. How can nostalgia for and the necessity of the Erstat be reconciled with the insistence and the inevitability of the fluxion of the flows? What can be done so that the decoding and the deterritorialization constitutive of the system do not make it flee through one end or another that would escape the axiomatic and throw the machine into a panic? A Chinese on the horizon, a Cuban missile launcher, an Arab hijacker, consul kidnapper, a Black Panther, a May 68, or even stoned hippies, angry gays, etc. I can just stop. That should not be relevant after 60. That sentence should have been not. There is an oscillation between the reactionary paranoiac overcharges and the subterranean schizophrenic and revolutionary charges. Moreover, one no longer quite knows how it goes on one side or the other. The two ambiguous poles of delirium, their transformations, the way in which an archaism or folklore in a given set of circumstances suddenly become charged with a dangerous progressive value. How things turn fascist or revolutionary is the problem of the universal delirium about which everyone is silent. First of all, especially psychiatrists. They have no ideas on the subject. Why would they? Capitalism, and socialism as well, are as though torn between the despotic signifier that they adore and the schizophrenic figure that sweeps them along. We are thus entitled to maintain two conclusions, already put forward and that seem to stand mutually opposed. On the one hand, the modern state forms a break that represents a genuine advance in comparison with the despotic state. In terms of its fulfillment of a becoming immanent, its generalized decoding of flows, and its axiomatic that comes to replace the codes and overcodings. But, on the other hand, there has never been but one state, the Urstaat, the Asiatic despotic formation, which constitutes in its shadow existence history's only break. Since even the modern social axiomatic can function only by resuscitating it as one of the poles between which it produces its own break. Democracy, fascism, socialism. Which of these is not haunted by the Urstaat as a model without equal? The name of the local dictator Duvalier's chief of police was Desire. Last bit of reference there is a Haitian comment. The horrifying piece of shit dictator Duvalier. His chief of police's name was Desire. Desire being part and parcel of a lot of these things. A kind of their snide joke there. Also, that reference earlier, paragraph, like, it's like it's written by Reddit right now. Am I wrong? Like, Chinese on the horizon, Cuban missile launcher, Arab hijacker, consul kidnappers, Black Panthers, May 68. I mean, people don't know what that is. There you go. Stoned hippies and angry gays. I mean, that's Twitter. Like, this is conservative Twitter. This is what fear-mongering news is throwing at us right now, across the board, even the liberal quote stuff. Christ, that's depressing. It's been 60 fucking years. Like, guys, let's move on. Something else to... Sorry, please, Varun. Or Jack. You.
I was going to comment real quick on that. This is something they start the section focusing on too, with the Gutenberg galaxy joke, right? There's something about these archaisms that nonetheless provides a functionality for what's going on in the process of production in the present, right?
There's a lot. But I think I keep pulling this back to like modern American discourse. It's, to me, I'm able to sort of slot it in very nicely. Lines like my favorite quote from Ben Shapiro or Milo Yiannopoulos or any conservative sort of during the 2016 sort of weird times, or 28, that period. The line, conservatism is the new punk rock, is like, it's a thing people said, and they meant it, and like I know it's laughable. There's a hello fellow kids mentality there, but at the same time there's a truth to that, in the sense of kind of how it felt for all of the people who were involved in it. There's this weird combination of the two sides. Out one side you have the hyper-fascism, the other side you have their version of the schizophrenic revolutionary charges. the Americanized version of that. It's really odd. We have a lot of stuff in our culture these days that this screams out to me about stuff that's happening. Paranoid overcharges versus the subterranean schizophrenic revolutionary charges, and how we oscillate constantly, how it works. Again, playing with desire as its focus, as core mode, versus just talking about interests or class interests or shit like that that doesn't.
Just want to comment on that. We talk a lot about the U.S. discourse in the server, but I want you to know it's our official stance. It doesn't matter what country you're from, so long as your country.
Terrible. That's terrible. That's fucking terrible. You lined up. You had me going for a second. I was like, okay, what are you gonna say? You had me for a second. That was awful. Why don't you tell knock jokes? Jesus Christ.
I don't know what expectations you had, bro.
I honestly.
I mean, that punchline was perfect for coming from this guy. That's the kind of jokes he made.
It's Christmas.
I feel bad for when he had a girlfriend and made those jokes with her.
Oh. Let's continue the next paragraph, then we'll probably finish off there. Well, there's 2 paragraphs left. Yeah, let's see what we can do, and then we'll spend next week. I would ask everyone, and I'll post about this a few times and ping people. Next week we'll do a retrospective over the section and go through some of the major points, because this is really important to understanding the book.
Yeah, because once we finish this book again, we'll just read it again and then again, right, Brooks?
Actually, yeah, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do a third run through.
No, it's brilliant. Then we can finally one day be like, I think on our third run through we should be like Acid Horizon and have like the fancy Neil deGrasse Tyson style introductions.
That's not gonna happen.
I'm Brooks, and this is the Closing Guattari Quarantine Collective with the music.
I barely like even having my name mentioned here. But we're doing a third reading for sure. It's not even a question. And I think I'm going to do readings of this like forever. We have enough people joining each time that it's worthwhile. Like, it's kind of amazing. So, but let me get to the next paragraph, and then we'll see if we can bust through this and not go too far over time. But the events that restore a thing to life, we're talking about the Earthstat, are not the same as those that give rise to it in the first place. We have distinguished among 3 social machines corresponding to the savage, the barbarian, and the civilized societies. The first is the underlying territorial machine, which consists in the coding the flows on the full body of the earth. The second is the transcendent imperial machine, which consists in overcoding the flows on the full body of the despot or his apparatus, the Earthstat. It affects the first great movement of deterritorialization, but does so by adding its immanent unity to the territorial communes that it conserves by bringing them together, coding them, appropriating their surplus labor. The third is the modern immanent machine, which consists in decoding the flows on the full body of capital money. It has realized the immanence, it has rendered concrete the abstract as such, and has naturalized the artificial, placing the territorial codes and the despotic overcoding with an axiomatic of decoded flows, and a regulation of these flows. It affects the second great movement of deterritorialization, but this time because it doesn't allow any part of the codes and overcodes to subsist. However, what it doesn't allow to subsist, it rediscovers through its own original means. It reterritorializes where it has lost the territorialities. It creates new archaisms where it has destroyed the old ones, and the two become as one. The historian says no. The modern state, its bureaucracy and its technocracy, do not resemble the ancient despotic state. Of course not, since it is a matter in the one case of reterritorializing decoded flows, but in the other case of overcoding the territorial flows. The paradox is that capitalism makes use of the Earthstat or affecting its reterritorializations. But the imperturbable modern axiomatic, from the depths of its immanence, reproduces the transcendence of the Urstadt as its internalized limit, or one of the poles between which it is determined to oscillate. And in its imperturbable and cynical existence, it is prey to great forces that form the other pole of the axiomatic, its accidents, its breakdowns, its chances of being blown to pieces, of causing what it decodes to pass beyond the wall of its immanent regulations and beyond its transcendental resurrections. Looking at the state, looking at the accoutrements that it has. Oh, look at all this stuff. We got this bureaucracy. Look at the old bureaucracy. It's not the same as the new one. Look at this technocracy, totally different. No, it doesn't look the same. It doesn't matter that it doesn't look the same. It's about operations. But the difference in one is reterritorializing code as it flows, but in the old, it overcoded them. Difference there, the way that it functions, but underneath all of it, the way that it functions, that it does those things. That's what makes the Urstadt. Thoughts, questions, anything before I jump to the final paragraph of the section? Take a nice break, relax, and sigh. And Varun, you're not going to leave the fucking server. Like a third reading of AO is going to be amazing. But we're also doing, we're going to do another one after Logic Ascents. We're going to probably to HP. So it'll be fun. But on this paragraph, do you have any thoughts?
No, I mean, I kind of want to go to the, let's finish the last one and then let's just go through it all together, I think.
Yep. Each type of social machine produces a particular kind of representation whose elements are organized at the surface of the socius. The system of connotation connection in the savage territorial machine, corresponding to the coding of flows. The system of subordination disjunction in the barbarian despotic machine, corresponding to overcoding. The system of coordination conjunction in the civilized capitalist machine, corresponding to the decoding of the flows. Deterritorialization, the axiomatic, and reterritorialization are the three surface elements of the representation of desire in the modern socius. So, we come back to the question. In each case, what is the relationship between production and desiring production? One sec.
Whoa.
My kid's stomping around.
You just slap?
Yeah, no, I just slapped the wall. He's hitting the wall with a stick. Like, no, not right now. Not right now.
Is it a fishing rod?
I don't know. It was very loud. I could not hear myself. Let's see. Where was I?
I mean, I think we can stop for a second now, though. I do want to talk about this point about representation.
Yep.
Because, I mean, one way to look at the way they talk about representation here, I think a simple sort of heuristic, is to think of representation, at least the way it's being used here, as a guide, a rule book, or like a stencil, a sort of thing that you can trace, right? Basically, a series of directions. So, what gets recorded on the socius are so during the organization of the primitive, what's recorded on the socius are a series of rules of coding, and coding functions by the recording of rules that tell it to code, tell the body without organs, or the socius, if you want to call it, that this is how the flows will function. And then same thing for the barbaric period with regards to the rules of overcoding. And then same with axiomatization, with the rules of axiomatization being basically these guides for the flows.
Yes.
The thing is that what the socius is doing, it's basically acting like a recorded surface for instructions. It's an instruction manual, really.
It organizes how production's performed, not far from how the subject is formed or production happens within the body without organs, how the BWO organizes and plays with all of that.
Yeah.
To continue. So we come back to the question, in each case, what is the relationship between social production and desiring production? Once it is said that they have identical natures and differing regimes. Could it be that the identity in nature is at its highest point in the order of modern capitalist representation, because this identity is universally realized in the eminence of this order and in the fluxion of the decoded flows? But also that the difference in regime is greatest in the capitalist order of representation, and that this representation subjects desire to an operation of social repression, psychic repression, that is stronger than any other, because, by means of the eminence and the decoding, anti-production has spread throughout all of production, instead of remaining localized in the system, and has freed a fantastic death instinct that now permeates and crushes desire. And what is this death that always rises from within, but that must arrive without? And that, in the case of capitalism, rises with all the more power as one still fails to see exactly what this outside is that will cause it to arrive. In short, the general theory of society is a generalized theory of flows. It is in terms of the latter that one must consider the relationship of social production to desiring production, the variations of this relationship in each case, and the limits of the relationship in the capitalist system. And that's 310.
I check at 458.
Oh, God. Oh, God. Oh, that's so painful. Oh, that's so painful, Jack. God damn.
See, this is what it means. Like, if do you really want to go through Anti-Oedipus again? We'll be reading this again, and then I bet when we reach that point in the book, he'll make the same joke again.
Oh, no, for sure. I'll probably make the same joke, though, too. So,
yeah, I don't want to be in that call when that's happening. Just saying.
Look, Nietzsche talked about our reading of Anti-Oedipus. He said very cleanly, do you want whatever you do now in this reading will be the reading we do forever? And you will be repeating it over and over and over through all of eternity. So just be remembering that. This is the never-ending reading.
Don't be horsing around, Brooks.
Look, you made someone leave.
I'm so sorry. This ending, this conversation, this last bit that they're getting to as we move into 311 is the discussion around this processual nature, how we get to where we are, and ultimately what is really playing underneath all of this. What is the theory of flows? We have to consider the relationship of social production to desiring production. We must return back to the pre-subject, to the unconscious, the variations of this relationship in each case, and the limits of this relationship, capitalist system, the way capitalism as a function changes our unconscious desires and the flows of our desires and the way that our subjectivity is produced. Paragraph here. Now I'd take it. But with that, any last questions or thoughts or anything, please? I'm going to go make some lunch. And I'll probably go bang on the walls with my kid. Get out of his system.
Has he started school?
No.
Oh man, you should on his first day of school, like just put a copy of like fucking like Phenomenology of Spirit in his hand. You walk in, Like the teacher would be so intimidated.
He does like it. I was reading Empiricism and Subjectivity to him last night because he came in and I was reading it. Read me your book. He didn't want to read his book. And it actually made him fall asleep. It was wonderful. I may read him more Deleuze.
Yeah, you got the makings of a child prodigy there.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Banging on the goddamn door. With that,
No, he's trying to deterritorialize the wall by constructing a new means of communication through asignifying signs. I don't know what the hell you're on about, Brooks.
Love it. But with that, since all of us are seemingly finishing up, Tiernan bounced, I'm going to go ahead and end the recording and everything. Thank all of you for joining us today, and join us next week. We will be doing a full recapitulation